Hello there, and welcome, Virtual Space Hero community, to another LinkedIn Live. And today, well, what should I do? I should start with a story, probably, right? Well, but as I'm not the perfect storyteller, I have somebody on my stage who will tell us how to perfectly start such a life event and or your training. And why are we doing that? We do know that in business, in leadership, in teams, and in training and in coaching, what really lingers, what really attracts our attentions are great stories, great storytellers. And probably all of you, you have one in your team or in your wider network or in your family, in your friend circle, a person who is a really good storyteller, and you see and here you remember him or her, that person where everybody is looking at their lips and listening to every word that he or she is saying, right? And this, of course, is a superpower in today's world because we do know that there is so much information that we are bombarded with in our daily life, in our organization, in our work, in our training, that a great storyteller can really make a difference. And today, well, I am super happy that I'm able to welcome on the Virtual Space Hero LinkedIn Live stage Rance Green, who is the founder of the School of Story Design, and he also manages the blog and the webpage Need a Story. Hi there, Lorenz.
Hello, good to see you, Barbara. Thanks for having me today.
It is fantastic to have you again here with us. It is really such an important topic that came up in many conversations that I had over the past years since we first talked about storytelling for leaders. And I
Mhm.
remember, Rance, you told me how you got into the field of storytelling, but maybe give us again a quick recap. How did you start to focus on storytelling?
Sure. Um, I have a background in theater. I have an acting degree, and then I also got a degree in choreography, believe it or not. So I am a dancer, and I moved to New York City. And so my experience in the field of theater was to create stories for people and to make those stories as accessible as possible for them so that, I moved them to, maybe take action on what was happening on the stage, to feel something. Um, and then later I was working with inner city youth in New York City, and the way that I connected with these kids was through storytelling. I would tell them stories of faith, stories of my own life. Sometimes I made up stories. And these were the ways that I connected with a group of kids that grew up in a very different environment than what I grew up in the mountains of North Carolina. Um, Fast forward a bit into corporate, and I am overseeing a compliance program, the training for compliance of a healthcare organization. And I'm in a position where I have the opportunity to bring stories to bear on training. And so all of our training, all of our communications became story based, and we saw an amazing impact on that organization, the culture of the organization. And so I've never looked back. I'm like, okay, stories work at work. So um, that's how I got into it, kind of in a roundabout way.
And I like that stories work at work, because sometimes we believe that stories are just for like our novel, what we are reading our kids or what we're reading ourselves. But no, storytelling entered the business world many decades ago already, or centuries even, because we do know that in the antique, even there was a lot of storytelling involved already. But when we talk today and when we look at our today's business environment and what you were mentioning, so storytelling should become a huge part of our business environment, of our teamwork, of our leadership. Today we focus on training, but you were mentioning you're using stories of faith, your own stories, sometimes coming up with story. How can we create great stories? So not all of us are storytellers or have a theater background as you have. So how can come up with great stories, or what are
Yeah.
the elements so that we can revise the ones that we are using to make them more captivating?
Wonderful. That's a great question. and one that I go into great detail in the book, Instructional Story Design, which is this instructional story design. So the crux of this is that as a learning professional, you are already doing a lot of work to analyze what is the root problem, what is the business outcome. Essentially, you're trying to find out the story. You're who are the characters, what's the conflict, what's the best solution here to get this to resolution. And so when you think about the main elements of a story for training, the way I define it is this: the first main element is relatable characters. And I use the word relatable because the learning audience needs to be able to have some empathy for that character. So if you're creating an audience profile of your learners, then you have a good starting point to know how to build a good relatable character for that audience, because you know who that audience is. But a lot of times we like to skip that part. you know, get to know who your audience is, like what they're feeling, you know, um, and what they're dealing with at work, who they are as people. Then you can create relatable characters. The second element is strong conflict. And I use the word strong because I want to remind everybody that, hey, we need conflict in our stories. Without the conflict, it's just, at best, it's a series of facts that's never going to stick with us. And it needs to be as strong as possible. And when you put these two basic elements of stories together, relatable characters and strong conflict, it has this wonderful influence on the person who's watching the story. It creates within them what I like to call a desire for resolution. And when you've sparked the desire for resolution, the story for training has done its work.
So there's always a villain and a hero or something like that. No.
No, not
That's
always a
crazy.
villain or a hero, no, but there is always conflict. And think of your analysis as an instructional designer as, creating a list of actions that you want people to take as a result of this course. And you're going to put your relatable characters in conflict with that action list. And then you have
Mm,
a tailor-made story for your course, for that
mhm.
audience.
So when we say, let's assume that we are able to identify the relatable characters, that we're able to identify or construct a good conflict in the story. When should we be using the story first, and when should we stop using the story? Are there any kind of rules?
Sure. So stories stories at work anytime should only be told when a change is needed. And so if you think on the business side, if you want to build a relationship with somebody, then okay, that's a change in relationship. So I need to I can tell a personal story and connect with that person, right? Or if I want someone to um, provide funding for my department, that's a great opportunity for a story, because what you're asking them to change is their commitment. Right now, they're not giving you funding, or they're giving you this amount and you want them to give you another amount. Training inherently has change.
Hmm.
We are looking for behavior change in the people who are taking our courses. And training inherently, so it has that inherent requirement for a need for change. Stories are an appropriate choice. And I'd like to talk about virtual training in particular, because I like what you're doing around virtual. So let me talk a bit about that. It has a strong case for stories, because generally a lot of virtual meetings and a lot of virtual training have lost the human connection. It's as if the same methods that were applied for e-learning when it replaced live training got adopted by designers of virtual training when virtual replaced live training. And
Mm.
somewhere along the way, like the human element just got stripped right out. But stories go a long way to restoring that humanness. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. And I think this is also something that we talked about in our preparation for today's conversation, that particularly virtual trainers can benefit a lot in order to bring back that human element that you were mentioning. So
Yes.
I'm just coming back to my thought now. If to my question before also, we were saying that we need to have relatable characters. We need to know our audience and be able to describe a character that they can relate to. And then we need to have a strong conflict. You also said that if I want to use stories, I only use them in a work context if change is needed. So, what do I do in a virtual training? Do I start off with the story?
Yeah.
Or do you sometimes have the feeling? I'm just thinking about the TED Talks.
Mm.
Sometimes I have the feeling that every TED speaker is starting like, let me start with a story. And I'm
Mhm.
like, oh, really, God, again. You know what I mean? And it's not like that I don't like personal stories, but sometimes they are just not that like moving for me. Maybe
Mhm.
I'm not relating or whatever, or they didn't relate to me. But I'm
Right.
like, how do you how do you start with the story so that it's really captivating? Is it
Right.
really always about I need to tell a story like related to me, or do you tell a story about the client? How do you do that so that people are really like, whoa, there it is?
Right. So usually, so we've all been in those kinds of meetings where somebody tells a story and you're like, uh, did not hit me, did not relate to that person. So then the person who's telling the story probably didn't do the best job in getting to know who their audience is so that they can make, if it's a personal story, make their personal story relatable to their audience.
Mm,
Or it's disconnected from their message in some way.
mm-hmm,
Usually a story for training, especially if it is a virtual experience or especially if it's e-learning, is not going to be a personal story. It's going to be a story about a character that is very much like your audience.
mm,
A story about a character that your audience will be like, "Yep, I know exactly who they're talking
mm,
about." A person who is in the position of the learning audience.
mm-hmm,
So that there's a lot of connecting points to that character. And to answer your story, like when, I would say yes at the beginning or close to the beginning is where that story comes into the training. And the reason I say that, Barbara, is because the the story itself provides that immediate connection if it's a well told story with
mm,
your audience. And it because there's conflict in it, there's this desire for resolution, and it's easily followed by just asking some questions of your audience. So here are some questions that I would ask after I tell a story. I would ask, how do you think the character feels right now? What do you think? And then let the audience respond and tell me how they think. Just reflect on what you've just seen, especially the emotional component of that story.
mm-hmm,
Next, give them something to solve based on the story. So another question could be, why do you think they feel that way? Now they're thinking a little bit deeper. And why do you think that conflict was there in the first place? Okay, what did that person do that made the other character feel that way? What could she have done or he have done differently? Now they're starting to solve based on the story.
mm,
Activities in your virtual training that would never be possible without the story itself. So once they've observed the story, they've critically thought about it, they have solved a problem based on the story, now they're ready to hear some training.
mm-hmm,
But
mm-hmm,
not until then. That's this is the effect. This is effective training, any training, but virtual has this added advantage of participants being able to share their reflections, share their solutions with the group in a live situation. And as the facilitator, you have the privilege of encouraging them in their solutions, redirecting them if they veer off course. It makes for an incredibly dynamic online learning experience. When the story comes first, then the observation, then the reflection, and then the solving. And now they're ready to hear you train them on something, on what they've been talking about.
And I think this is exactly what Buddy is posting here as a comment. It's restoring the human element, right? I love that wordplay. Buddy, thank you so much, Buddy Broids, for this comment. It would really make me smile now.
Restoring. That's nice, buddy.
Renz, if we think about now how to restoring these the human element, is there a maximum number of stories, or should we, for example, use always the same character, the same story throughout the whole training, or or would you encourage to use different stories, different examples slash stories throughout the training, and is there a maximum number?
So usually I will tell one major story, and I will keep referencing that story throughout the course. Um, and like we could be near the end of a 3-hour virtual training course, which I do, and be like, remember back in the beginning when we watched that story? And we've been referring to that story the entire time because that story contains everything, because it's based on the action list. It contains everything for behavior change. And usually, I mean, I have done courses where the story goes from the very beginning all the way through an hour-long e-learning course. And like
Mhm.
you're seeing different characters, and then it's very complex. And at the end, all the characters come together. That's a very complex way to do it. It doesn't need to be complex. One story can do the trick. So I wouldn't say that there's a maximum or minimum. Just
Well,
there has to
minimum,
be.
sorry, the minimum would be one, right?
The minimum is one, yeah. Yes, that's correct.
Okay, but and I'm thinking now, do you think, from your experience, that it might be more impactful from a designer and learning designer perspective if I use one story throughout the training that builds up complexity, challenges, differences? Because I think that I never did that because I rather use different characters, different short stories for different topics. And sometimes I was even thinking that maybe that's a little bit too much. So I'm just
Mm,
reflecting on what I'm doing. And also, honestly, I don't think that I necessarily in all my stories build in enough conflict. So probably I'm
mm.
rather adding facts to some characters, as you were saying at the beginning. So critically reflecting my own storytelling practice. So, what would you say, coming back to my question, would you say that it can be more impactful if it's one well elaborated story throughout the training that is not overwhelming with too many, many characters, too many contexts, too many whatever for the learners?
Yeah. First of all, I just I like your honest assessment of your own, like adding facts to a character. That's done quite a bit, and I think that people do consider stories that aren't necessarily stories because they don't contain conflict. But I would say that my go-to is one story. Perhaps at the very end, I might show how that story could be different if that character had applied the training that we had just gone through. But I steer clear of showing stories where everything goes hunky dory or really nicely, no conflict whatsoever.
Mhm.
Because when we watch those kinds of stories, we're like, well, good for you, good for you. You did everything great. That's not reality. That is not the world I live in. you
Mm.
know, but one of the things I think that, Barbara, you can consider is what are the external pressures that your learners are feeling at work? What are the conflicts that they have right now? What are their fears? You can bring those external pressures into your story, and boom, they are like, oh, this designer knows that we have production numbers to meet. Even though production numbers has nothing to do with what they're training me on, it does have an influence on what you're training me on because it's a pressure that I feel at work. And
Mm,
those little pieces of information that we know about who our audience is, when they make it into our story, make that story real, make that story relevant to them, and convince them that, hey, we've done our homework. We know who you are, we know what you're dealing with, and we know that taking on these new behaviors is going to be maybe a heavy lift for you, but let us show you why it's going to be great for you.
mhm.
It's just a respectful way to acknowledge the things that they're dealing with at work, and stories can kind of get all that gray stuff, that stuff that's in the middle, that's just life, and incorporate it very efficiently into a story.
Okay. I'm just thinking, do you also, because you're thinking about theater, I once wrote a blog article on how to use objects or props in your training, in your virtual training, particularly, of course. And so you're coming from theater and you have that kind of background. Would you also say that while using storytelling techniques, it might be helpful to use objects, props, whatever they are that you are using that makes it in a virtual training? Just coming back to
Right,
our question today,
right,
what is the missing story in virtual training? Is it also about making it more 3D to some extent?
right, yeah. I love props. So, yeah, I think that someone who uses a prop effectively in a live setting, either in person or virtual, has a lot going for them, because if you can take a pen and the pen takes on a meaning other than just being a pen, but it means something, then you've got, let's say that the pen represents a point in time. You know, this is when I started as an instructional designer. You know, from here all the way to here
Let's see what you're coming up with. Okay, good.
represents, my tenure as a learning professional. And something happened here that really affected the entire course of my career. When I was here, my manager first told me. And so now this pen is becoming something, right? It's becoming like a point in time and a pivotal moment in my life, you know? And so I can refer to this now, and I can keep referring back to the pen as an object that has meaning beyond the object itself.
Mm.
So I love that you use props. That's wonderful. And we do that in acting too. You're welcome.
I'm usually way too slow with those cards, but sometimes you see I have them right at hand here.
And I'm excited to talk about the missing story because we haven't gotten to that yet. So, but we will by the end of this talk.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for pointing that out, Ren. So let me pick up on the question. So, what is the missing story in virtual training then?
You can't just ask that. Okay,
Can I
I
not?
will.
Okay, wait. I'll build up a little bit of drama around it. Well, there was something missing and it was lost. No, come on, Renz, I want to know because that's why we are here. So, what is the missing story in virtual training? We talked a lot about, you gave us fantastic tips on how to build a story. What are the elements? So, I really took away a lot of learnings for myself to not be adding facts after facts, but rather having a conflict. But what is the missing story in virtual training now?
Okay, so I will give you some first. I'll give you three guideposts for your virtual training, and this will help reveal what the missing story is. So the three guiding principles that I use in I do a workshop called story-based virtual training. And this is what I teach virtual designers and facilitators to test the effectiveness of their stories for training. So first, use the story design model. Relatable characters plus strong conflict equals a desire for resolution. Does that story contain relatable characters for your audience? Is there strong conflict that produces a desire for resolution in the learner? If not, go back, revisit that story, and revise it. The second principle is this: discovery. The question I want you to ask yourself is, did I give the learner an opportunity to self-discover the actions that I am training them on? Or did I test? If you find yourself telling more than helping them discover, go back to the questions that you ask people after you've told the story and examine, did I give them a chance to reflect? Did I give them a chance to solve something based on the story so that they could self-discover it? Because self-discovery is going to stick a lot longer than just telling people. And lastly, the last principle is this: discussion. Was the session alive with discussion? Or was it a one-way training session with a few interactions that really didn't give your learners that much practice
Mhm.
doing what you have been trying to train them to do? If you have an effective story, if people are self-discovering, and if there is discussion, if it's alive with discussion, then you can walk away from that virtual experience knowing that storytelling had an impact on the knowledge, on the skills, and on the attitudes of your learning audience. So will someone change their behavior because they have the skills and the knowledge to do it? Maybe. But what if they also have the confidence and the motivation to do it? A lot more likely. And storytelling really gets at the motivation part, the attitude part. So, what is the missing story? What's the secret? The missing story in virtual training. You know, you want to know what it is.
Go ahead, go ahead. You've got
I'm
it.
building it. I'm building it up. Yeah, there's a desire for resolution. So, the missing story gets told when people start talking because the
Mhm.
story is the story of your learners. If you don't learn something new about your learners when you're training them, or if you don't learn something new about what you're training from the learners in that session,
Mhm.
you've missed the whole point of storytelling for virtual training. Our stories for virtual training are simply a point of connection that helps others share their own stories, share their own insights, share their own expertise. A conversation centered around storytelling suddenly humanizes the whole virtual experience.
Mhm.
That is the missing story. And if that's missing from your virtual training, it's likely that your story isn't hitting the mark, your training isn't hitting the mark.
Mhm.
You can absolutely transform the virtual experience when you have storytelling, discovery, and discussion.
SDD. Would you call it like that?
I guess so. I've never thought of it like that. uh,
And I love that because you're not only connecting, so that goes way beyond what I was expecting that the message will be, because you're relating it to a lot of like learning transfer and instructional design, virtual instructional design principles that are
yes,
so super important.
yes,
And just relating here also again to what I'm sharing, school of story design, those of you out there who want to become better storytellers and learn more about the missing story in virtual training and how to overcome that, dive deeper into storytelling discovery and discussion, what Renz was discussing now, head over to the webpage School of Story Design and check out the upcoming courses, and or subscribe to the newsletter, what I did, so that I'm the first one to be updated and informed when the blended learning course comes out. So I'm very much looking forward to that. And follow Rans also here on LinkedIn as our main networking platform. Rens, I'd love to ask you one last question that I'm still thinking a lot about. You were mentioning the motivational part, and I like that a lot because I do design even my questionnaires based on learning transfer design principles, like the evaluation questionnaires, right? And having the confidence, but also the motivation to
Mhm.
put some change in behavior in practice is one of the central elements of learning transfer. If you think about storytelling and the change it creates in your learners, how are you able to, or do you evaluate that? Do you measure it? Do you ask people afterwards also to get better? So how could we do that as
Mm.
like novices in virtual or in storytelling in virtual trainings to become better storytellers? Do you see what I mean?
Mhm. Yeah, so a lot of the ways that you can evaluate a story, we know already, from the science that we know now that stories work. Stories work well for integrating new knowledge and skills, and even for affecting our attitude towards something. The way that I encourage the students at the School of Story Design to evaluate their stories is from the model itself. And so, what I'll ask is share this story with somebody who is either going to be your learner or as close as you can to the learner.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and ask them these three questions. Ask them, do you feel like you relate to these characters? Secondly, did you feel a desire for resolution? And thirdly, did this story seem real to you?
Mm-hmm.
And by answering those three questions, you get a lot of information, a lot of information about the design of your story. If your characters are relatable, if your conflict is strong and produce that desire for resolution, and if it was plausible, if it was a plausible story that they feel like would happen at the workplace. So
Mm.
that's how I encourage people to evaluate it. Now, I have done evaluations, like formal evaluations of and separated the story out to see how impactful that story was in the training itself, just for my own curiosity. And I can give you a quick example of that if we have time.
Absolutely.
Okay, so um, and this is only one of the methods that I use, but one of the methods I used was I showed a scene from the story that took place in training. And the story was stick figures in this particular, um, it's like animated stick figures. And I had a this was about 9 months after training had been taken. I sent this survey. And so one of the questions had this picture from the story, and it had, a speech bubble, but the speech bubble was empty. And the question was, what is the character saying in this scene? And 94% of the people who took that survey were able to determine what was in that speech bubble, what that person said, why what that character was doing was wrong, and what they should have done instead. So the story contained everything needed for the behavior change. I could have asked them, I want you to think back to slide number 15 and tell me what bullet point number 7 said. And you know what the response to that would have been.
Yeah.
But because the story stuck with them for 9 months after the training, they still knew what the ethical choice would have been in that particular situation. So do you think that when they find themselves in a similar situation that they might remember that story
Mm-hmm.
and remember what to do in that situation?
Oh, I love that example. I had never thought about that, how to integrate the story even in the evaluation afterwards.
Mhm.
Fantastic. Great example. Great example, Rance. Thanks a lot for sharing that. And still, we have one last question that I definitely want to pick up here. Diana is asking, what about e-learnings when there is no possibility of discussion and interaction? So how do you,
Mhm.
what's your recommendation here?
I love that question, Diana. So I've created I don't know how many e-learning courses that have been story based, and um, there are there are questions that I like to use that are like reflection questions, such as like the example that I gave earlier. You know, you just watched this story unfold. It was about a cashier at um, a retail um, a retail establishment, and the cashier was nice, but she was making the customer feel uncomfortable. And so this training is all about helping your customers to feel more at home in the store. And so we watch the story unfold. The cashier has just had this interaction. There's conflict. You feel it. You have this desire for resolution, and you follow it up with a question. You know, how do you think this customer is feeling right now? And you have a list of options. You know, it's multiple choice. Maybe it's select more than one. There's no right answer, and it doesn't matter that there's a right answer because you're getting them to reflect on what just happened. Then you want to move into sort of a maybe a solving um, question. So, why do you think that the customer feels this way? Well, and then maybe like an open text box. They can type anything they want, right? They and start them thinking through the reasons why um, that customer feels that way. Well, the cash register lady, like didn't greet them. That she seemed like she was having a hard day. It's whatever the answers are there. Then you follow it up with some hard questions like, okay, what would you have said in this case? Give four answers that are not giveaway answers, plausible answers, um, good, better, best, and then give feedback based on their choice. So e-learning has some advantages, but it has does have the disadvantage in that we're not in person discussing this together.
Mm,
But it is
mm,
possible, and I would say it's extremely possible when you think in terms of what can I do to give my learning audience practice doing what I'm training them to do based on the story. It becomes a lot easier with the story because now you've got something to keep referring back to. Okay, think back to the story. What should the cash register person have done in this situation? Give some options, or make it a different activity. Think a little bit more like, what can I do to give them practice? What can I
mm,
do to give them practice? If you can give them practice in that e-learning session of, you know, whatever the action is to, giving the credit card back in a certain way or whatever it is, you might have to think out of the box. But the e-learning is so robust, it can do a lot of things.
mm,
But don't just go to the bells and whistles. Don't just say, okay, interaction means a drag and drop. No, that is not that is not the kind of action that we want people to take. It might be part of the solution to make the practice happen, but it's not an interaction in and of itself.
mm.
Great question.
Thanks so much for the elaborate answer on that as well. I appreciate that a lot. And thanks so much for your time, Rance, to really join us here again on the Virtual Space here, LinkedIn Live. It was a pleasure having you. Again, a big thank you from our side.
Thank you too, Barbara.
So we had a great conversation. I'm super happy because I took away a lot of learnings. So the next time, be prepared. I'm starting my LinkedIn Live with a great story, and I'll well next week, next Thursday. Don't miss that. Be here. We are going to discuss with Joshua Davis. We are talking about resilience and Well, let me surprise you with what I'm coming up with, okay? You also know that we have the all the features and all the guests, the LinkedIn Live guests already on our webpage. So head over to virtualspacehero.com. The live shows, you can already check out what is coming up. We are having a break in May and are coming back in June. And again, the summer break, July, August. So check out the webpage, set yourself a reminder. And thank you very much for all your questions beforehand. Also, your comments now from Deanna. It's very inspired. Rams is definitely looking at you. And also, Buddy is commenting here. Thank you very much for being with us. It was a tremendous pleasure. Have a wonderful good morning, afternoon, evening, or good night. And don't forget to become a virtual space hero. Bye.